Well, howdy, everyone, and welcome back to the Rancher Podcast. Today we are going into episode 2 of Yellowstone 1883, and I cannot wait to talk more about some of the historical background behind that. As I've said before, the 1883 series has provided an excellent chance for us to delve into the American history of the late 1800s. And as you all know at this point, it is definitely one of the great passions in my life to talk about American history. And, I think a lot about the West and its place in American culture. Um, the West has inspired so much. From the earliest days, the people who inhabited the West played a massive role in the popular imagination of not only folks back east, but throughout the entire world. You think about the Japanese influence on denim, and denim, of course, came originally from the miners and other folks that came to California, and then also became iconic with, craftsmen, farmers, ranchers of all sorts. And there's just this rich tradition that has made its way all the way over to Japan. So I think a lot about how the Western way of life influences culture. And, on top of just clothing and lifestyle and whatnot, I also think about the Blood and Thunder novels, which was, you think about, dime novels from the late 1800s on up through the early 1900s. These were kind of cheap pulp fiction books, if you will, that, told these outsized uh, tales. I don't know. Fictionalized versions of true stories of men like Kit Carson and Bridger and so many others that had been made their name or cut their teeth in Western United States. And then, of course, as we get into the 20th century, we think of the Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett series from Disney. The golden age of westerns. It seemed like every movie that was made for a while in the middle of the 20th century was some type of western movie, and we got names like John Wayne, and of course movies like Giant. And there's been this trend, if you will, of the Western way of life being romanticized, but it's typically backwards looking. But that's not as true today as it used to be. There's a lot of new creators and people who are telling the stories of the West, and they're using platforms like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, podcasts like myself, and of course, also we have on the big screen and on the small screen, we have the works of Taylor Sheridan, and he doesn't necessarily look back as often. Many of you know about Yellowstone, and of course, 1883 is his prequel that we talk about here on the show. But before he made these, he had already made a name for himself with a few other movies, including Sicario, Hell or High Water, and Wind River. And what you might not know about that series is that Sheridan had actually called them a trilogy. And if you've seen the movies, you probably have a difficult time kind of understanding how they're a trilogy because they definitely are not connected. You've got the same actors in some of the movies. The storylines are a little different. But the common thread for him is that they are a trilogy of the modern day American frontier. And if you think about it, the stories of the West these days do unfortunately run into stories of exploitation of Native Americans on the reservations and the squalid conditions that occur there. They run into the southern border crisis and war that's going on with the drug cartels. And of course, with Hell or High Water, we hear the story of a family that's losing their land and their livelihood because of the way that the market and the economy in small town America is changing. And I think that although it's very different from the romanticized view that we have of the world in the Western world specifically, especially the older years, this is part of the Western American story, and I'm just so thankful that it's being told. These are incredibly interesting stories that show you the resiliency of the people of America, and not only that, but the trials and tribulations that we face. So I just wanted to say that, you know, the story of the West is still being written, right? It did not end the day that civilization came to the West. We have new problems, and we have new people fighting these battles. But, you know, while many eras of Western media have looked towards the 1800s, I think it's important that, just like Elsa tells the story of her family in 1883, that all of us uh, take on that duty of telling the story and preserving the way of life that we have today. So I just wanted to start this episode by getting on my soapbox, I guess, and talking a little bit about why I'm passionate about this podcast and the Western way of life. So let's get into episode 2 right after a quick ad break. Well, I'm proud to welcome the newest sponsor for the Rancher podcast, and that is Elite Ranch Consulting. They are your one stop shop for protecting your real estate investment. Whether you inherited a piece of land, bought a ranch as your vacation home, or are simply looking to maximize the land you are already working, Elite Ranch Consulting's team of experts can help you make the right decisions to make your land profitable. Visit EliteRanchConsulting.com today to learn more about how they can protect your American dream. This episode of Yellowstone was entitled Behind Us a Cliff. And I think that, you know, it's an interesting metaphor because, of course, on the plains of Texas, there aren't too many cliffs until, of course, you get into the Paladoro Canyon and some of the other escarpments and things like that. But it's essentially more of a metaphorical cliff. And if you've seen the episode, you understand that the reason that they say that is because this is kind of the no turning back point, right? People die in this episode. Uh, you know, the camp is lifted, the wagon train is moving west. This is kind of the chance for you to go back to the safety of Fort Worth, or are you going to try and make it all the way out to Oregon? So, quite an interesting title, and of course, we hear the main character Elsa tell us this in her, um, you know, her voiceover, and you know the Duttons at this point have agreed to assist Captain Brennan and Thomas with guiding the immigrants up the Oregon Trail. So the major plot points of this episode are that they need to find a sustainable food source because, as Thomas says, and Captain Brennan, Shay, which of course is Sam Elliott's character, that these folks, these European immigrants, are probably used to 3 square meals a day, and they're not really ready for the hard, rough foraging life of the trails. So they need to find food, and they also need to learn how to protect the camp's inhabitants from essentially themselves. Of course, there's also common thieves that they will run across, but it's really a self-preservation issue that's coming up in this. Um, so, you know, the sustainable source of food that James Dutton, Tim McGraw's character, and the others come up with is that they are going to go ahead and just buy a herd of cattle and drive that up with them, and of course, whatever's left at the end, they could probably sell for a pretty good profit. Um, Now they go into Fort Worth to try and buy these cattle, and learn that much like today, the price of beef is a little too steep for them. So a few of the hands at the stockyards there suggest that they go and round some up near Fort Griffin. So of course Dutton and Captain Brennan hire some of the guys working there, and uh, Dutton grabs his daughter Elsa, and they head out for Fort Griffin to round up these strays. One of the key lines here was they were talking about, you know, we're gonna go pick up these cattle, and they said, well, you know, we can't leave the immigrants alone, and he said if, you know, Sam Elliott's character, Captain Brennan, says, "Well, I'd rather learn now than later if they can't survive just sitting by a river." And unfortunately, as we learned later in the episode, it seems that even that is quite difficult for these immigrants. And I think that it could be easy for someone to look at this series and think of it as making fun of the immigrants, or you know kind of using them as cannon fodder, if you will. But I mean, the truth is that so much of this stuff is accurate, and it's not necessarily that these immigrants were stupid or whatnot, but the American West just poses a incredibly difficult obstacle for anybody to overcome. We'll get into later all the ways that you could meet your death on the Oregon Trail. But if any of us today were to be transported back to that time, sure, you might know to stay away from snakes or whatnot, but the amount of just accidental deaths that occurred from all kinds of things, diseases, whatnot, it was a difficult thing. And so I don't think that you should look at this show as making fun of the immigrants as much as telling the true story. I mean, they were incredibly brave people. I mean, Joe Rogan always says that your ancestors that came over here had to have been some of the wildest people around, because for them to be willing to get on a boat and go to a place that they had never seen before. There were no movies back then. Of course, by 1883, you had photos and whatnot. But to be willing to just show up one day and head west into the land that you had never seen, you didn't know what was in front of you, was an incredibly brave thing. So I don't want to diminish that by talking about the quick and easy deaths of these immigrants, but it certainly paints quite the interesting picture. And of course, I think all of us will, unless you're a Native American, will know that these folks were much like your great grandparents who came over here looking for a better life. And I think that we need to pay them homage for what they did. But I digress. We'll get back into the story. To give some historical context to this drive to Fort Griffin to pick up cattle, you may remember that in my episode about the fence cutting in Mabel Doss Lee, the fence cutting wars were actually at a fever pitch in the summer of 1883. I don't know exactly, I'd have to go back and look, but I don't know exactly what time of year Yellowstone 1883 occurs in. I assume it's somewhere in the spring, because it's somewhat green in the beginning. And of course, I don't know of many people that would set off on a trail up to Oregon, at the end of the summer nearing winter, because of course that would not put you in the best strategic place to make it through. So perhaps the war itself hadn't actually hit this fever pitch when the Dutton and Brennan crew make their way out to Fort Griffin, but it certainly was an issue at this time. There was a massive drought that year, which had left much of the state without enough forage to feed the massive herds of cattle that were roaming the plains. And the cowhands that were used to the old way of life, that had no fences, were likely convinced that the grass was much greener, or at least more abundant, on the other side of those barbed wire fences. So I bring that back up to point out that this might explain the beef prices. They wouldn't be able to purchase these cattle in Fort Worth because they were in high demand because of the lack of supply. But I think it also kind of contradicts the ability to round up these strays. The fence cutting wars came about, of course, because of the drought, but also they came about because most of western Texas had been fenced around. I mean, Mabel Doss Lee was one of our examples, but so much of this area was now strung across with barbed wire. So I feel like making the 130-mile trek from Fort Worth to Fort Griffin would have been quite difficult to get the cattle And second of all, I'm not sure that there would have been stray cattle at that point. For two reasons. First of all, the land had been fairly settled at this point. There were major empires and kingdoms that were sprouting up all over the place, ranching kingdoms, and because of that, there weren't too many feral cattle left to be picked up by groups like this. And second of all, the drought most likely would have killed them. I mean, if these cattle were somewhere that was remote enough where they could survive without being rounded up, it likely was not very good land, first of all. And second of all, any water source had probably been fenced in by whatever rancher was around to ensure that he could protect his cattle. So, I say all that, and I'm not trying to, attack the historical accuracy of the series, but just wanted to give you a reminder of what was happening in the year 1883 in West Texas with cattle. It was a quite contentious time, and I think it would have been pretty interesting if they had used this plot point to bring up the folks that had been cutting fences and maybe gotten Dutton into a little side war or side quest here. As I had mentioned in the Mabel Doss Lee episode, they had some colorful names, some of these gangs that were going around cutting fences. And, I think that it would have been very cool, very interesting for them to come across one of these and see how that worked out. But, of course, the 130 miles due west of Fort Worth would, be a pretty good place for you to look for cattle. But even today, you can find a great herd of cattle at Fort Griffin. In fact, it's the Texas State Longhorn, official Longhorn herd. And you heard that right. The state of Texas has its own official Longhorn herd, and part of that is housed there at Fort Griffin State Park to this day. So, I'm sure that some of those cattle that were there may have had ancestors that were roaming free at the time, but it's an interesting story to say the least. So let's talk a little bit more about Fort Griffin. The Fort Griffin State Park, which now encompasses the original Fort Griffin, was founded in 1867 to protect the surrounding settlements from the Kiowa and Comanche Indians, which had been in the area. If you've read Empire of the Summer Moon, you know that this area was known as Comancheria, and the likelihood of running across a to say antagonistic is to put it lightly, band of Comanches would have been very likely. But the fort was set up there along with many others, including McCavitt and Bliss and some other more notable ones, to help protect the western frontier. So the camp was originally named Camp Wilson, and then took the name Fort Griffin from the Union general and military governor of Texas under Reconstruction, Charles Griffin. I find it interesting that this fort got a Union name. If you look at Texas history, many of the forts, including Fort Hood, are named for Confederates, and for this fort to, first of all, receive the name, and second of all, to keep it is incredibly interesting, especially for a military governor, which meant that he had been implemented under Reconstruction law by the federal government. So maybe that is why this fort was rather short-lived. It was actually abandoned in 1881. But regardless, it actually had a very colorful existence for the 14 some odd years that it was around. Here's what the Texas State Historical Association has to say about the fort. The town of Fort Griffin grew up on the level bottomland between the military fort bearing the same name and the Clear Fork of the Brazos River. The fort stood on a hill, and the town site was frequently called the Bottom or the Flat. U.S. Highway 283 runs by the site about 15 miles north of Albany in northern Shackelford County. The town that began in the late 1860s grew and quickly gained the reputation of a lawless frontier outpost that attracted such women as Lottie Dino and Molly McCabe. Lawman Patrick Garrett, of course known better as Pat Garrett, Doc Holliday, and Wyatt Earp, along with outlaws such as John Wesley Hardin and, of course, John Silman and John Larm, who both lived on both sides of the law. By 1874, the lawlessness of the community had become so extreme that the commander of the fort placed the town under government control and forced a number of undesirable residents to leave the town. This situation lasted until the organization of Shackelford County later in the year. The community served as a major supply source for buffalo hunters, along with the sale of hides and meats being done here. The Butterfield Overland Mail route passed west and north of the town site at Clear Fork Crossing, and herds on the Western Trail from 1875 passed it en route to Kansas. So I find that really interesting. That's a lot of information right there. But Fort Griffin sounds like a more remote version of Hell's Half Acre there for a little bit. I mean, the amount of notable folks on both sides of the law, as they commented, was quite interesting to me. It seemed like, if you're a fan of Star Wars, it seemed like where the cantina would have been. And it's interesting also that this is where there was a crossing. When I was researching this episode, I found it interesting that, Dutton and Brennan would go out of their way all the way west to Fort Griffin to grab these cattle and then turn back and go and get the folks for the trail to Oregon. Because, like I said, the Butterfield Overland Mail had a crossing here, which meant that they could have crossed the Brazos here. And then also, of course, you would have saved time, because 130 miles ride from Fort Worth to Fort Griffin would be about a week-long trip both ways. Or not both ways, but total. And so I found it interesting that little detail about this being both a crossing, but then also a cattle town, which, it makes it even more questionable that there might have been stray cattle in the area, because, of course, these men that were driving cattle up north through here would have likely picked them up. But furthermore, the Fort Griffin had a newspaper called the Fort Griffin Echo that was published from 1879 until 1882, and it actually had a local academy that was operated for several years. At its height, they had a permanent population of around 1,000, and about twice that in folks that were somewhat more transient. But of course, the lack of buffalo later on drove folks further south, and the lack of soldiers when it closed down led to the untimely demise of Fort Griffin. So I've not made it out there, but the Texas Historical Commission has made a lot of great improvements since they took it over about 15 years ago, and they've maintained some of the original structures like the mess hall, the barracks, the administration building, the powder magazine, and actually a bakery. There's also a hand-dug well, a cistern, and then a rock chimney. So you can actually go out and check these places out, which is a great way to also go and look at the official state herd of longhorns. If you haven't seen longhorns, this was, a lot of people see longhorns today. They've become an ornament, a lawn ornament, if you will. But for a while, they had lost their desirability to other cattle breeds, and so it was kind of a rarity. We talked about during the Charles Goodnight episode how he saved the American buffalo, and now there's a state buffalo herd as well. But the longhorns were becoming just as endangered, if you will, just due to lack of breeding and whatnot. So I would encourage you to go out there and learn more about the official herd of Texas, but also check out this really cool piece of history in this small town. So it's likely that the cattle crew of Dutton and Brennan's probably stayed pretty far away from the fort itself, because by 1883, if it was a lawless town while the military was there, I mean, the number of ne'er-do-wells that would potentially be in the area was quite large. So, they likely grabbed the cattle from nearby and tried to make it back without being noticed by anybody nearby. So, with all that in mind, of course, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the idea that they left the immigrants behind by the river and went out west and then came back is still somewhat curious to me, especially now, with the hindsight of knowing that these immigrants were attacked and resulted in quite a few deaths due to the raiders that came into the camp. You know, I'll have to defer to the knowledge and experience of Captain Brennan on this point, but I just find it interesting that this is, um, one of the how this occurred. But of course, I do enjoy the cattle driving experience of this. Of course, it was cool to see the incorporation of this part of American history, and we haven't seen something this fun as since Lonesome Dove. So of course, always thankful for that. And I think that wraps it up for today's episode from a historical background perspective. The Duttons certainly have their work cut out for them in the next few episodes. If they keep their current pace, as I mentioned earlier, they're going to be rolling through the inhospitable lands of the Northwest in pretty bad winter weather. So you factor that in along with the dead weight of the wagon train that's expecting safe passage with little to no knowledge or experience of the area, and I think you have a recipe for disaster. But of course, first, they have to make it across the river. So I want to thank you again for joining me on this journey through 1883. If you have any input, I would love to hear from you, so of course, do not hesitate to reach out. And lastly, I just want to reiterate that the story of the West is still being told. The battles are still being fought over our way of life, and although they happen more often in courts of law, legislative chambers, and hedge fund boardrooms than in the open plains with rifles and bows, it is up to us who are here today to be stewards of these great lands and resources for future generations. So until next time, Godspeed and God bless.